reaction in the forward direction. Remember, the hydrolysis of ATP is spontaneous, so what we're doing in this case is we're taking a spontaneous reaction where we give off energy, and we're coupling it to a non-spontaneous reaction that requires energy. So what we will hope is when we add up the total energy changes between these two reactions, if the sum of those two is a negative delta G total, now we can have this whole process move in the forward direction. So let's take a look at thinking about what we can do in terms of a coupled reaction. The first thing we need to do if we're thinking about using the hydrolysis of ATP is actually calculate what the delta G for the reaction of ATP hydrolysis is. And I picked 310 Kelvin because that's the temperature of our bodies. So again, this reaction is taking adenosine triphosphate that has 3 phosphate groups and hydrolyzing it, so reacting it with water to form ADP plus phosphate plus acid here. So I'll tell you that the delta H of this reaction is negative 24 kilojoules per mole. This is what we actually calculated in class on Friday. And that the delta S is plus 22 joules per K per mole. So we can go ahead and calculate what this delta G is here. So the delta G of this overall reaction is just going to be, of course, delta H minus T delta S. And our delta H is minus 24 kilojoules per mole. And we'll subtract 310 Kelvin times 0.022 kilojoules over K mole. So if we do this, what we end up getting is a delta G of negative 31 kilojoules per mole of ATP. All right, so again, this is good. We got a negative number. That's what we were expecting. So that means that we will have energy available to use if we hydrolyze ATP and couple it to another reaction here. So what we saw for our delta G, negative 31 kilojoules per mole. All right, so let's talk about a reaction that is an ATP coupled reaction. And there's just tons of examples of this in our body. One I picked because it has to do with glucose, which we've talked so much about, is the conversion of glucose to glucose 6P. So 6P, P just stands for a phosphate group here. So what we're doing is taking, if we numbered the glucose carbons, this would be carbon number 6, and we're putting a phosphate group on carbon number 6. So first of all, why would our body need to do this reaction? It turns out that glucose, we know that we use glucose for energy. Glucose is somewhat apolar, so it can actually move in and out of our cells because our cell walls, those are very greasy. So what we're actually doing here is we're putting a charged molecule onto the glucose. There's 2 negative charges on a phosphate group. This is going to make sure that our glucose is now a very polar molecule. And now that we have a very polar molecule, we're not going to be able to have the glucose move in and out of the cell. So we keep it in our cell by putting this phosphate group on it. So that's why we want to do this reaction. But let's think about the energy of actually doing it. And it turns out that this requires energy. The delta G for this reaction is 17 kilojoules per mole. All right, so that could be a problem if our body had not come up with a way to solve it, which it has. And what it actually does is it couples this reaction here with the conversion of ATP into ADP. And we just calculated that that has a delta G of negative 31 kilojoules per mole. So this means we can think about delta G total, and by total we mean of this overall process here. So that's just equal to 17, and we're adding it to the other delta G, which is negative 31. So we get an overall delta G for this process of negative 14 kilojoules per mole. All right, so that's one really simple example just to illustrate to you how these ATP coupled reactions work. Some ATP coupled reactions require 1 molar equivalent of ATP, some require a lot more. But essentially the idea is the same. We have this reaction that's energetically unfavorable that we couple with an energetically favorable reaction. So quite literally this is what we mean when we talk about ATP as being the energy currency for the cell. We spend some ATP in order to get these non-spontaneous reactions to go. All right, so I also want to talk